What is going on, Canes Sport? Izubee Charles, joined by Steven Wagner for another Inside Canes recruiting podcast. Steven, another busy weekend down there in Coral Gables, and that met another big-time commitment for the Miami Hurricanes, getting a major flip in four-star cornerback Jontavius Wyman out of Georgia, Jonesboro High School. He was formerly committed to the Georgia Bulldogs, but made that move down south and committed to the Canes. Steven, you've been all over this recruitment, and kudos to you for making that call a week before that you projected him to flip to the Cane. So just take us behind the scenes at Jontavius Wyman commitment and why he ultimately wanted to be a Cane.
Yeah, so I really felt good about the prediction whenever I made it a week ago. It definitely seemed like things were trending in that direction. Was originally supposed to get down for the Hurricanes pool party on March 29th, ended up not being able to. Is still expected to get down this coming weekend, the weekend of April 12th. I thought there was a great chance that he was going to commit on that weekend. Kind of let our subscribers on the message board know that it sounded like I thought he could potentially commit. Then ended up pulling the trigger a little bit early. And one of the reasons why I entered that RPM was, whenever I heard that things had kind of been trending toward the Hurricanes, that it seemed like the staff was really starting to gain some confidence that he could end up in Coral Gables. I gave Jontavius a call and I asked him, would this be a pick that would make sense? If I went ahead in RPM due to Miami, would it make sense? And what he told me was, well, with the way that things are trending right now, with the way things are looking right now, I don't think that would be a bad pick at all. So went ahead and entered the pick. A week later, here we are. Shout out to Zach Etheridge and shout out to Will Harris. This is absolutely a huge recruiting win for them. Miami's hoping it's going to be the first of many, but these are the types of recruits that Will Harris and Zach Etheridge were brought in to bring to the Hurricanes. Miami, obviously, last year was supposed to be a really big year in the secondary. A ton of secondary players that we really had a lot of confidence in. Just in terms of their overall ability. Obviously DJ Pickett was the crown jewel that Miami wanted. They weren't able to get him. They lost Hilton Stubbs to Florida late. They ended up just signing Jabari Antoine. Tripping over my own words here. They ended up just signing Jabari Antoine, Chris Ewald, Amari Wallace, and Bryce Fitzgerald in the secondary. And of course, that is still a pretty good secondary haul. But considering how deep last year's secondary class was, that definitely is a little bit of a disappointment, especially considering that, at one time it looked like Miami could bring in, 6, 7, 8 possible defensive backs in last year's class and really kind of tried to address the secondary, considering that, obviously the secondary has kind of been pretty so-so at best since Cristobal got here. Bringing in a guy like Wyman, I think, is an awesome start. Obviously, not the only guy that Miami has on their board. They've now got 3 4-star cornerbacks committed. I think they could still go ahead and add Justice Fitzpatrick from St. Thomas Aquinas as well. I think he's a player that I'm going to be keeping a pretty close eye on. I think the Hurricanes are kind of continuing to do well there. Mario Cristobal obviously has played a very significant role in recruiting him. Mario Cristobal has personally been his primary recruiter. Really think the Hurricanes are going to have a good chance there. Cortez Redding, safety from Jonesboro, believe it or not, Jontavius Wyman's teammate, I think is another guy that we're going to be keeping a pretty close eye on. It wouldn't stun me if he ends up in Coral Gables as well. This is another year where I don't think it would really shock me that much if Miami took 6 or 7 defensive backs. Chauncey Kennan is another guy that Miami, is really, really high on the Hurricane. Guy that the Hurricanes really want. Although lately there has been a lot of buzz around Georgia and Florida State for him. But this absolutely is the start that Miami needed to their secondary, or in this year's secondary class, especially considering that, this basically is, the first DB that Will Harris and Zach Etheridge have been responsible for. Jalen Waters, it already looked like he was probably going to come to Miami before Harris and Etheridge were actually hired. And then Camden Portis obviously committed to the Hurricanes last fall, but this is a great start.
Yeah, like you mentioned, shout out to Coach Etheridge and Coach Harris. They really did, hit the ground running, whether that be on the recruiting show for the Hurricanes. Obviously, you land a big-time guy like Jontavius Wyman, and obviously, Jalen Waters being there, having the chance to, add him to the class. But even in the 2027 class with a guy like Ken Dobson, coming into South Florida, establishing those strong connections, even with the guys, down the road who are to be future stars for the Kings. So really, really big kudos to those guys for landing Jontavius Wyman, who was previously committed to Georgia. And obviously, it's not really easy to flip a commitment from the Bulldogs, especially from an in-state kid. But Miami did just that, and a very good prospect, like you mentioned, the third four-star cornerback Miami commit that they have this cycle, joining Jalen Waters and Camden Porter. So that secondary class is looking really, really good. I know last year we talked a lot about that in that 2025 class, but this 2026 class has the potential to be an even better secondary haul. And like you mentioned, guys like Cortez Redding, Justin Fitzpatrick, and many, many more DBs on that list. Excited to see how this board kind of fills out and comes all together. When it's all said and done. But right now, it looks really, really bright. And like I said, shout out to Coach Etheridge and Will Harris for that. Obviously, Jontavius Wyman took those, that visit, earlier this spring, and things really started to shift that way. But looks like they were able to close that one out. So, excited to see, what this DB class ends up like I just said. Speaking of in-state guys, we'll stick with Georgia. It seems like Miami's really upped their recruitment in the Peach State. And this past weekend, one of the top prospects, not only in Georgia, but in the entire country, Bryce Perry-Wright, was down there in Coral Gables for the first time since that Florida State game. And he actually canceled his official visit to Georgia, swapped that out for the University of Miami on June 6th through the 8th. I kind of had the chance to pick his brain a little bit after he spent time, in Miami with the new staff. And he said, it was just that, meeting Miami's new staff, meeting Coach Heatherman, meeting Coach Lewis again, meeting Coach Jason Taylor again, who he has really good ties with thanks to his uncle Ray Lewis. And he just said, seeing the defense, how they played, their philosophy, their scheme, how they envision him in that defensive line room really kind of changed where things stood with Miami. Because to be honest, coming into that visit, I wouldn't have called Miami a major contender for Bryce Perry-Wright. He had not yet set up that official visit, but he did leave, campus setting up that OV to the Kings. So make sure to check out that update that we have on him and kind of where things stand. And I know someone on the message board said, is this going to be kind of a BS visit? I really don't think that's the case. I think he really has general interest in the Hurricanes. Like I said, thanks to the new defensive staff, Coach Heatherman, Coach Lewis, and then obviously Coach Taylor, who's the only guy that was held from the previous defensive regime. So make sure to check out that update on him and all that he's saying. And Steven, you caught up with another big-time priority for the Canes in the 2026, and that's running back Jay Lamar, who had to spend multiple days on campus this past week. Just what's the latest on him? Where did the Hurricanes stand with, another prospect from Georgia out of Colquitt County?
Yeah, Jay Lamar, younger cousin of Nye Carr, the Miami receiver who flipped from Georgia to Miami back in the 2024 cycle. I think this is absolutely a name that Miami fans are going to want to keep an eye on. Now, typically, you don't really think about Miami going into Georgia's backyard and bringing their guys all the way down to Coral Gables. I think Miami is right there for Jay Lamar. It doesn't, to me, feel like Georgia is maybe as high for Lamar as some other schools. I think Clemson's a school that's doing a really good job and is going to be big-time competition for Miami. But I love the job the Hurricanes are doing. Someone told me, you don't take two multi-day unofficial visits to a school in one spring unless you are very, very serious about them. That's what Jay Lamar has just done. He took a multi-day unofficial visit back in late January, early February, right before the dead period. Took another multi-day unofficial visit last week. Hurricanes, I think, are in a great position for him. It absolutely would not surprise me at all if Miami ends up potentially even landing Jay Lamar. I think that's how much faith I have in the Hurricanes right now. Definitely wouldn't call Miami a front runner by any means. Definitely wouldn't put in an RPM for Miami to land Jay Lamar, but I do think the Hurricanes are giving themselves an excellent chance. And obviously, I'm going to go ahead and address this now because I know people are going to ask me about it. If Jay Lamar and Javian Mallory were to both commit to Miami, what would Miami do with Derek Cooper? And I haven't been able to get a straight answer on this, but I think what would actually end up happening is if Cooper ended up coming to Miami, telling them he wanted to commit, even after Lamar and Mallory had already committed, I don't think the Hurricanes would just simply turn him away and say, sorry, class is full. Miami does want to take two backs, but if their top two options on the board want to join the Hurricanes, I don't think there's any way that Miami would simply turn them away and say, sorry, guys, class is full. I think that there's a good chance that Miami could end up taking three just because I simply wouldn't see them saying no to Derek Cooper in the event that Jay Lamar and Javian Mallory would both come. Of course, obviously, that would be a big-time champagne problem for the Hurricanes. And right now, I mean, there's still no guarantee that Miami would even be in a position where you have to discuss taking three. I don't think there's any guarantee Jay Lamar ends up at Miami. But I really do think the Hurricane, or Derek Cooper for that matter, but I really do think that the Hurricanes are in a fantastic position for Jay Lamar. I really like Miami.
Yeah, a lot of Peach State prospects on the Hurricanes, recruiting board this cycle. And the last three guys that we talked about are all from Georgia. So really, really big push Miami's making in Georgia, during the 2026 cycle. And obviously really close, well, not close, but the closest state to the Sunshine State. And a lot of big-time prospects are coming out of there. So shout out to Miami staff for, making that journey up north to trying to conquer Georgia, which is pretty funny to see. But sticking on the topic of offensive weapons, another big-time 2026 guy was on campus this weekend, and that is Texas four-star wide receiver Jalen Lott. He's a guy that we've really, started to bring attention to his name in the past recent weeks. Obviously, Miami staff really, really likes him. When he made his way down to Coral Gables, you saw the excitement from those guys greeting him when he walked into campus, saying, "Hey, man, we finally got Jalen Lott on campus." And it seems like this visit had a huge, huge, huge impression, on the four-star Texas wide receiver, and he's going to lock in an official visit. Steven, another guy that you spoke with this past week, and just what are your thoughts on where things stand with Jalen Lott and the Miami Hurricanes after his first spring visit?
I think Miami might have actually made more progress with Jalen Lott this weekend than anyone else that got to campus. Miami was kind of one of those teams that was, sort of it had they had Jalen Lott's attention. I definitely wouldn't call them, a top contender for Lott or anything like that. But Miami rose significantly on this visit. He's going to go ahead and lock in an official visit before he leaves Miami. Now, when that official visit is going to be, I haven't been able to confirm that just yet, but I am expecting to see him back on campus because, man, Miami really just did an absolutely phenomenal job, not only with Lott, but with his family too. He brought his parents down. Both of them were very impressed by the Hurricanes. Donovan Varner and Kevin Beard really did a freaking awesome job with him this weekend. I think that the Hurricanes are in as good a position as anyone for Lott. It still feels like this is pretty up in the air because he's a prospect from Texas, but he's already received an RPM to Oregon. Texas, obviously, the Longhorns they've shown that they are making an extensive effort to throw a ton of resources and NIL at top players in the state. Then USC is going to get him for an official visit too. And then he also has a crap load of SEC programs after him too. And Ohio State on top of that. So, he's one of those players where, everyone agrees he's really good. He's high on Miami's board for a reason. And everyone agrees that this is a really, really good player. I think that Miami right now kind of has as good a chance as anyone, but I can't really get a read on him for where he might be leaning at this moment. I really still think this is anyone's race.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think this recruitment is wide open, but looks like Miami definitely moved the needle in that recruitment, having him down. He seemed really happy when he left Coral Gables, and obviously, Coach Kevin Beard making that push. He's one of his top guys in that 2026 cycle, along with guys like Calvin Russell, Jason Lopez, Samarin Wingo, Masai Hampton, and a few more guys that are really, really high on Miami's recruiting board. But make sure to check out that update on Jalen Lott and all the guys that, we spoke with this week. And also want to give a shout out to Miami 2026 four-star commit Darron Coleman for, earning that invitation to the Elite Eight finals in Los Angeles later this summer. Had a pretty nice story with him on that this past weekend, just talking about, how he felt getting that invitation, what he's looking forward to doing in Los Angeles. And, like Darron Coleman, he said, just want to be the top dog like I am in every camp. And I really do think he has a chance to really, really cement himself as a really high four-star prospect. I know a lot of people on social media are always saying, give him his fifth star, things of that. Doesn't really work like that. There's much more to the five-star ranking, that mythical, precious ranking. But definitely think you'll see his stock continue to rise after super, impressive spring, and just, ever since the end of his junior year, really, really shined and, solidified himself as one of the best quarterbacks in the country. Steven, just wanted to get your quick thoughts on, Darron being named in the Elite 11 finals, and just how big is that? Obviously, it's a pretty prestigious event.
Not a surprise to me at all, especially considering the arm talent that Darron has. Obviously, football's a lot different in pads than whenever you're throwing in 7-on-7. But we've already seen what Darron can do in pads. He got his team to the state championship last year. I think he's going to have an awesome shot to get his team back to the state championship game again this year, potentially even close the deal. But these 7-on-7 events, these Elite 11 events, they were made for kids like Darion to shine. Kids who have, these really rocket arms and have these awesome traits. He's got great velocity on his balls over the middle and in the short game. He's got a rocket arm that I seriously think he might be able to throw the ball 50 or 60 yards in the air. And hit receivers on deep balls. Really, really like him in that regard a lot. Lightning fast release. Does not telegraph throws, I did telegraph throws a little bit last year. I think that is one area that, just from being able to see him in a couple of different settings so far this year, I think that's a area where he has gotten tremendously better. I really, really think he's going to have an awesome shot to be an Elite 11 quarterback. And, before Luke Nickel finished as an actual, before Luke Nickel, who finished as an actual one of the 11 top elite quarterbacks in last year's class, the last time that Miami had a quarterback that actually finished in the top 11 at Elite 11 was Brad Kaya. So it definitely been a minute. I don't honestly know if Miami's ever had back-to-back Elite 11 quarterbacks. I am going to need to look into that for sure. I know Emory Williams, went to the event a couple of years ago. He wasn't one of the top 11. Or he didn't finish as one of the top 11. Darion's going to have a great shot to finish as one of the top 11. I think that that's going to be another thing that's only going to further cement his ranking. I think that, Luke Nickel ended up being, kind of around the top 100 mark last year. It would not shock me at all if Darion Coleman ends up somewhere around the top 100 mark in this cycle too, once we eventually get all the way through.
Yeah, shout out to Coach Shannon Dawson, honestly, for those two early evals because Luke Nickel was on board with the Hurricanes super, super early. And then we just saw as he progressed through his junior, senior year, just how good of a quarterback he really was, leading Milton to two straight championships. And, even Darion Coleman, over the summer, a lot of people thought he was headed to Oklahoma. Miami hadn't really been in the mix. And then he comes, balls out at the Miami camp in the summer, and then, wins a 7-on-7 event and obviously locks in with the Canes. And now his stock just continues to rise and just, obviously people love to talk about, he's not the biggest quarterback and things like that. But, hey, at the end of the day, kid's arm talent is as pure as it gets, across the country. And a lot of people are starting to notice that. So, shout out to Coach Dawson and, congratulations to Darion Coleman for that. Pretty big accomplishment being named, finalist for the Elite 11 and having the chance to, solidify yourself as one of the best quarterbacks in the 2026 class. And, earlier on the show, I know you mentioned that Jontavius Wyman is, expected to be headed back to Miami for their spring game on April 12th. But it's kind of crazy to think that, spring's almost over. These last three practices are going to wrap it up for spring ball and wrap it up for busy recruitment down there until, official visits kick off. Just, as we head into this last week of spring, just kind of what are your overall thoughts? And, do you think this was a successful spring for Miami as we close out, obviously, landing, commitments it seemed like every single week this spring?
Yeah, absolutely. Just since the start of the spring, since the start of spring practices, you've gotten Ben Congdon, you've gotten Jalen Waters, you've gotten Joel Irvin, you've gotten JJ Sparks. Now you've gotten Jontavius Wyman too. The Hurricanes are red hot on the recruiting trail. They have generated serious momentum for themselves this spring. We've already got 9 commits. Wouldn't surprise me at all if they get, maybe 2-3 commits, something like that, before we actually start official visits. Then obviously over the summer, that's when I would say the majority of Miami's class is probably going to come flood again. I would expect Miami to probably have somewhere around the 20-ish commit range by the time that the fall season actually starts. Then obviously Miami's going to look to hold on to those guys and then maybe pull off 1 or 2 surprises, maybe pull off a couple of big flips, and then go ahead and finish strong with a bang. I think that Miami has gotten off to the best start they possibly could have hoped for this spring.
Yeah, hit on a few big-time targets, and I don't expect that momentum to slow down. Like you mentioned, this last week of spring, I expect Miami to be full pedal to the metal, and that spring game is going to be absolutely massive. We saw last year how many recruits were there, and I wouldn't be surprised, like you said, to see if Miami closes out the spring with another 2 or 3 commits. So make sure to stay tuned with Kane Sport. We always say, make sure to check out our message board, even with Steven dropping gems like that. You can try out the Kane Sport message board for a week, and the site in general have a ton of content, whether that's recruiting, football, team news, basketball, and anything in between. So if you like this video as well, leave it a big thumbs up. Come join us, our discussions at canesport.com. For Steven Wagner, I'm Izubee Charles. Thank you all for watching.